I'm Buddy Ebert, SEWISC board member. I'm pleased to introduce two experts from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources who will discuss instances in which invasive species can spread through trade, including specific routes that may not be common knowledge or that may go unaddressed. We look forward to hearing about Wisconsin's efforts to halt this pathway and learning how we can all help. Patrick Siwula is an aquatic invasive species biologist at the WDNR based out of the Plymouth office, responsible for a 15 county coverage area in southeast Wisconsin. Patrick primarily focuses on aquatic invasive species prevention through the pathways strategy, along with responses to new findings of high-profile aquatic invasive species on the landscape. Sam Haferkorn is a DNR Division of Public Safety and Resource Protection Conservation Warden, covering Milwaukee County. A conservation warden has a wide range of responsibilities, including enforcing all of the fish game laws, recreational vehicle laws, environmental laws, and state lands protection in Wisconsin. Sam serves on a task force which primarily focuses on enforcement and investigations into people smuggling and selling aquatic invasive species into the state of Wisconsin. Thank you. Without further ado, you guys are
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yes, awesome. Well, I'm really glad to be here. It's really nice to be in a room with like-minded people, talking about the topic that we're, of course, very passionate about, and maybe you guys haven't heard much about before. So really, we're talking about instances of invasive species in trade, both aquatic and terrestrial. A little bit about me, and sorry for the bar on the top of will go away at some point. I'm a biologist with Wisconsin DNR. I work at our Aquatic Invasive Species Program, covers southeast Wisconsin, so 15 counties, the Lake Green, and a lot of lake there. I do a lot of different things. One of those is organisms and trade. So that's what we call the buying and selling of live animals, live plants that may include invasive species. It is just a portion of my position. I highlight that to kind of note that there's not a lot of us out there working on this topic. There's some people here in the room, but it's certainly a topic worthy of addressing, regardless of how many of us are working on it.
Hi, everyone. I am Sam. I am a conservation warden here in Milwaukee County. I've been with the department since 2018, and I've been here in Milwaukee County for 5 years. And we have a wide role, as it was discussed earlier. As conservation wardens, we have a lot of different avenues and topics we enforce, but I serve on a task force that specifically addresses the investigations into aquatic invasive species into the state of Wisconsin. About 5 years ago, we got federal grants that serves for, I believe, 4 conservation wardens, 2 detectives or special investigative wardens, and 1 supervisor for that grant cycle, with the focus on the investigations into bringing these aquatic critters into our state. In that 5-year period, we've had over 220 convictions, with a lot more still pending in the court systems across the state. And we work with Patrick and his colleagues, and the biologists, to do outreach and education, along with my supervisor works with the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission to do a bunch of other outreach across the state.
And I will say our law enforcement task force on this is a lot of recognition. This is not work that is traditional warden work, and a lot of states are not engaged with the level that we are. So big shout out for Sam and his group for kind of leading that charge regionally. We'll have to do a few boring regulation slides, so bear with me on those. If you're not familiar, in Wisconsin, we have something called Chapter NR40. So that is our invasive species rule or law, and it basically outlines which species are regulated. What does that mean? How do we prevent? How do we control these species? And the primary goal of this is to slow, not entirely stop. That's actually not possible. We want to slow the spread of invasive species in Wisconsin, emphasizing education and voluntary compliance. And last, it's really important. We do have enforcement. We can resort to that. We want people to be compliant with these regulations of their own accord, because it's the right thing to do. We have 2 classifications for invasive species, called prohibited and restricted. It's a designation to kind of outline species that are not very present or not present at all in the state, and for which we could have a chance of actually eradicating them. That would be your prohibited species. The example would be Jill with the giant hogweed, or Hydrilla, We don't have hydrilla in the state. We have that one population of hogweed and Sheboygan. Those are high priorities, right? Versus restricted species, which are those that are already widespread, right? Rusty crayfish, garlic mustard, the examples I've chosen to highlight here. Not going to get them out of the state. We're here. They're established. That doesn't mean we want to ignore them. Still want to focus on those, particularly in high quality areas, keep preserving our natural biodiversity and reducing the impact to the best extent we can. Important distinctions: prohibited species, not even allowed to possess those, right? If it's on your property, the state would like you to control them. Restricted species, you are allowed to possess them, but you cannot buy, sell, or transfer them, right? So you're not beholden by law, control all that garlic mustard on your property, but you have giant hogweed, the state would like you to see that control. So a little bit of distinction for you. So what are we talking about? Organisms in trade, we call this pathway. What is a pathway? It's essentially the means, modes, methods that invasive species move around on the landscape. In Wisconsin, we've identified 7 for our aquatics program, which organisms in trade is one of. Another example would be recreational activities, right? So boaters, hikers, moving around, maybe inadvertently spreading plants or seeds via yourself, via your own equipment. So organisms in trade is super broad. It can include traditional sales, online sales, and the reason it's an issue is those species that are bought and sold then be introduced to the environment. This could be either intentional or unintentional. Sometimes people don't know. And we can end up with things like goldfish in our local lakes. It's actually my niece. We took her to learn how to go fishing last year, and the first thing we caught was a goldfish. So, second thing we caught was also a goldfish. So, it's an unfortunate issue, but it's something that we can work together to address, right? Why does this matter? Because these things do happen. These are a few examples in recent years of either aquatic animal or terrestrial animal, aquatic plant escapes that these are just the ones that have come to our attention, right? So that's an actual goldfish. That's Greenfield Park Pond. That thing's been in there a while and grew to be a giant species, right? People do crayfish boils and oftentimes import invasive red swamp crayfish, and then we find them walking down the road. So that's a little example. We've had that happen times in Wauwatosa and Eau Claire. One found an Oscar fish in the Milwaukee River in the Burnham Canal. They fished that up. Some of you may have seen it a couple of years ago. And we, of course, often have problems with aquatic plant releases. And again, not all of this is nefarious or intended to be, oh, I'm going to throw them and get this out in the environment. Oftentimes people don't know. They don't have options. And they think that, hey, we've had this goldfish in our tank. We'd like to set it free. Well, that's not the best thing for the animal or for the environment. And yes, we did have an alligator on the Grant Park Beach a couple years ago. I've had like 5 alligators in the last few years, so keep your gators at home. All right. The ultimate shock value slide, if you'll indulge me. So red swamp crayfish in particular, most commercially available crayfish in the world. We did have an instance where we got established in a condominium complex pond in Germantown called the Esquire Estates. And it took us almost a decade and almost $1 million to eradicate them. Many landscapes have changed since then. It's not something we're probably going to be able to address via that level of resources. It becomes even that much more important. These are highly aggressive crayfish. They can be native fish. They can alter plant regimes under the water, and they can be less palatable to our native flora and fauna than normal crayfish because of that highly aggressive behavior. So we don't want to have to do this. We can't always do this. So it's my shock. How do we do this? It takes a village. It's kind of my main takeaway. But we have a lot of agencies, a lot of groups. We have DNRSEC, law enforcement, we have folks, partners and citizens like all of yourselves. They really are a part of this, right? Even consumers have a big role to play because every time you make a purchase of a plant or an animal, that's supporting your particular purchase, whether it's native or otherwise. And this requires a lot of coordination, right? Between our agencies, I think prior to a lot of this organisms and trade work, Warriors would do their work, biologists would do their work, and we don't have a lot of cross connection, right? Doing this kind of work has helped break down those silos and build interdepartmental collaboration, let alone of all the collaboration we're seeing with groups on the outside, the actual industry. We've got a lot of partners in the actual aquarium nursery industry, such as Johnson. We have JNR Aquatic Animal Rescue, various others that have come on board and are sharing this mission.
The piggyback off that, it's really important that this work has started and now other states are starting to be receptive to some of this work because our laws are very different than Illinois or Iowa's or Minnesota's, Michigan's, whoever it may be. But some of these states are starting to recognize that this is an issue in their state and these things are going past just state lines. They're coming across the country and it's a bigger issue than everyone really anticipated.
And that's important because species, plants, animals, etc., do not know about state lines, right? They'll be moving where they want to move, regardless of those artificial boundaries. So in that OIT pathway, we then break it down further into what we call subpathways. So these are all these different things you see here: plant trade, biological supply, food industry, aquaculture, pet trade, gate trade, life release, e-commerce, et cetera, et cetera. And this is just to highlight that this isn't a one-to-one. These industries or these kind of subpathways touch a lot of different industries, a lot of different groups, and there's a lot of interconnectedness. When you start pulling apart the supply chains, the ways that things are being bought and sold and traded, it becomes this kind of complex web. And the economy is certainly part of it. We're talking about sales, we're talking about businesses, we're talking about the bottom line. And that's a big factor to keep in mind, not only when the state creates regulations, but when enforcing them as well. So we're going to go through and highlight a few instances of species in trade in some of these pathways. We're not going to be able to get to them all today. As always, if you have questions, you can feel free to reach out to us. If you see things for sale, reach out to us. That'll be a big part of our plug at the end. So, in broad, this is probably the most commonly known and most common way in which invasive plants, particularly terrestrial plants, can be bought, sold, traded, moved around, perhaps introduced to the environment. So this is the ornamental plant trade pathway: landscaping, gardening, big box stores, ornamental breeding, all of these different things fall under this bucket, right? So what do? We can do outreach, and then we can also have an inspection and kind of an oversight program, which is one of our main flagship programs for this topic of organisms in trade. And that is our DACAP nursery inspection program. So to get around some of the craziness, basically the big takeaway, craziness of how we have things set up, that is, the main takeaway is that DACAP has a set of inspectors that go into nurseries and perform inspections, not only for invasive species, for things like pests, pathogens, etc. This inspection authority is for businesses that sell over $250 a year in perennials. And then there's an arrangement where DACAP conducts the inspections. However, they do not have the enforcement authority. So then DNR handles the enforcement on behalf of DACAP, highlighting again the need for that really close collaboration between agencies to be able to share information, pursue enforcement when necessary, and there is a protocol and kind of repeat violations, gravity, species, prohibited or not, goes into the calculus for when we do enforcement. We always try outreach and education first, with enforcement really being for those repeat offenders that are not getting the message. We have protocols for people to address species that they have in their stock, timelines for them to have to get rid of them if they're found during an inspection, along with follow-up compliance, right? And like I mentioned, this is not just for NR40 species, also for things like seed labeling, diseases, license requirements, etc. So really one of our front lines of defense against species in trade. Interesting data, which I think is pretty cool to see. These are nursery inspection and our 40 findings over time. First thing you'll notice is, of course, they would be going down over time. It's great. We think that is some indication of success in this program, and I think that's valid. Another thing to keep in mind is our invasive species law in authority really isn't that old. It only came into effect in 2009, and there was an update in 2015. So it can almost kind of be expected that it's going to be higher in the beginning while people are learning the regulations, coming into compliance where they may not have been previously. And it may not be uncommon to see a slight bump when we have changes. There's an invasive species rule update in 2015, and potentially going that bump in 2016. But the main takeaway is we think this is working. Some of the species findings here, you can see black arbor, barberry is definitely one of the biggest ones. Honeysuckle, woodman, forget-me-not, Chinese wisteria. And then for this year, we had enforcement cases brought on Trader mulberry, woodland forget-me-not, Japanese honeysuckle, and Java water dropwort, which is a species we'll talk about earlier, and I will highlight a bit more in a little bit. Lastly, DNR is looking at new standards for when to conduct enforcement on these cases. It's another graphical representation of the most common violations in nurseries. You can see that's Japanese barberry at the top, definitely a stickler, some pun intended, due to the thorns. Highly prevalent in the landscape, has lots of cultivars, which is another topic we'll talk about on the next slide. Woodland forget-me-not, amber maple, burning bush, bishop's gum. But you can see that big pie of other species. There's a lot of other things that make up this violation list. Let's look at a couple case studies. This at the top there, it says Costco burning bush. It's a big box store, right? There's Costco's all over Wisconsin, all over the country. And from a distributor supplier store standpoint, it can be very confusing when They're allowed to sell any kind of burning bush in Illinois, but they can only sell certain kinds in Wisconsin, right? So in some instances, this case study, we had several reports of a dwarf burning bush for sale at a Costco. Burning bush is a NR40 species. In that case, our DACAP folks and the supplier have to work with the store to verify that this is an exempted cultivar. What do we mean by that? So NR40 outlines that certain cultivars of certain species are exempt from listing, and that is due to the species assessment process where they've been supposedly shown to be either sterile or have lower invasive characteristics than the pure strain or whatever it is. This is a really tricky topic, and this is something that the state continues to contend with. There are some updates coming, and we're doing another rule update right now with NR40 to try and get our arms around this, working with industry, working with other states who are also experiencing the same issue, because the ornamental plant trade's going to go in gangbusters in terms of making new cultivars all the time that are showy and great and that people love. Well, how do regulations catch up with that? And how do we find the balance between regulation and also allowing industry to exist? So cultivar is definitely a hot topic lately and something that the state is trying to work on and tighten up our regulations and be more consistent with that. Another case study that is near and dear to my heart because it's been a big project I'm working on lately. It's Scott McComb was in the back there from UWC grant. So Java water draftwort. This is a new species for me. We have a lot of species on NR40, and we can't really know or learn about them until we see them, especially for stuff like this, where we only have a handful of populations in Wisconsin. And this is a really good example of from nursery, from store to landscape. So basically, we had several instances of this being sold in nurseries this year. We've also had it present in previous years. And we've also been finding it out on the landscape, really large populations, in fact, and in some cases, not too far from where some of these places of sale have been. And going a little further, we even found that this species is actually apparently present in the food industry as well. We didn't have that on our radar before, used in sometimes various ethnic dishes, and could have been a way that this species got out onto the landscape. Once it's out on the landscape, we kind of have to circle the wagons. And that's another big part of my position is response to findings of AIS out on the landscape that we don't have a lot of presence. How do we address those? So we are working with SEWISC to sponsor a grant to get some control. We're also working with Milwaukee County where a lot of this is found. They're going to be doing some control on their own. And it's a really good example. This population, particularly in the Root River Canal, spans Milwaukee and Racine County. We're working with both counties. We're working with SEWISC. We're working with Sea Grant to address this. It does take a minute. Jumping worms. Who's heard of jumping worms? Yes, no, okay, wow, that's a lot more than I thought. So what I'm trying to highlight here is that it's not only species that are being intentionally bought and sold. We also have some hitchhikers to worry about. No nursery is trying to intentionally sell you jumping worms. They don't want them either. Practices aren't tight. If people aren't screening orders, not cleaning them off, being aware that you even have them in the nursery in the first place, start sending those out to tons of people, and all of a sudden we've got a jumping worm problem on the landscape. It's particularly troublesome for these species because they just don't have good management techniques for it. They're extremely hard to eradicate. If anyone here has had experience with that, they're probably still working on it. And there's some, if you can get your compost to a certain temperature and things like that, you can work on it. There's no silver bullet. So it's not only the things that are being intentionally bought and sold, it's the things that may come along with it. We didn't even know were there. We do try to do a lot of research, right? On specifics. So we actually just made some new fact sheets. These are regulated invasive species in the nursery trade. Brand new, hot off the press this summer. I've got a bunch of copies up in the front. And you can also find this on our DNR webpage. It was made by request of our DACAP to have something they can use for outreach and themselves as kind of a go-by when they're doing inspections when out in the field to help with education and outreach. It talks about each individual species. Here's our burning bush case study again. Orange is restricted, red is prohibited, different names you might see, and then there's some exemptions, right? So for this one, all of the cultivars are exempt. It's meant to be a quick guide for these species, visual, regulatory, and also common names, jargon, things like that. One interesting, next one is promoting native alternatives. We've also partnered with Finn, DNR Minnesota, and a few other folks to make these landscape alternatives brochures, which essentially highlight, hey, you were thinking about fish and scoutweed or snow on the mountain or whatever invasive species. These are the native alternatives that should fill that same niche that you should look at again. We've got a bunch of these available as well out in the room. I think there's some at the SEWISC table, some at the AIS table. These have been really popular. They've been flying off the shelves, and you can also order big stacks of these from the DNR warehouse. You just go on our website, look up publications catalog, these will be shipped to you for free. Please help us get them out on the landscape. One interesting thing that we have explored with this topic of the ornamental plant trade is using an influencer, so to speak, as the kids are calling it these days. Basically a social media presence, someone who has a big following, who's non-governmental, who can help increase our reach on this topic, right? So the DNR chose to partner with Melinda Myers, who is a popular horticulturist, do a set of videos, right? We work closely with her on these particular videos. She has lots of other stuff on her website. This would have been the first time the DNR tried this approach. Other states and agencies are trying this approach now, increase reach and kind of get that other voice that's more from the people to the people, if you will. I think we've learned a lot from this. I think we'll probably be continuing with it, but it's been interesting to kind of see that level of partnership. It's something that the state hasn't engaged with before. So webinars have been really popular. I think a bunch of them, maybe some of you have attended. They've gotten like 500 attendees from all over the country on some of these. So you can find those on DNR YouTube, and I believe she has a YouTube page as well. All right, moving on. So ornamental plant trade. Now we are moving to a new sub-pathway, which is classrooms. Live organisms used in classrooms, which we often call biological supply. This would be for teaching curriculum. It could also be for research purposes, like people at universities and things like that. And this can be problematic because NR40 species could be used. And I'll give a few examples where NR40 regulated invasive species are actually part of classroom curriculum, directing folks to use those species to display certain traits. And this, of course, is a problem because it's illegal to buy those in the first place. And oftentimes, things will be sent home with students. Here, take this crayfish home, and then they want a free willy, and then we have something in the environment, right? We have that photo there, perhaps. First example is Aguirre densa. So this is Brazilian waterweed, Anacharis. It's got a lot of different names. Highly invasive species. You can see a picture of that on the bottom right. We do not have this yet in Wisconsin, but this exact species is pointed to in actual classroom curriculum that teachers, educators could have a license for, be signed on to buy. That's not right. We don't want that, right? Because A, they're going to be in violation of the law if they even buy it in the first place. B, are their practices going to be sound enough to prevent that from escaping? Are they going to dump the aquarium water at the end of the semester and then it gets in the local pond and I got to go work on it, right? We have a native alternative. This seems like a no-brainer, right? We have a native Elodea. It displays cytoplasmic streaming well. That's the curriculum topic that this species is often used for. And you can even get it from your local waterway. You don't even have to buy it online. We've been trying to do some work with classroom supply companies, things like that, to make sure, A, they know the regulations. If you're giving curriculum to people in Wisconsin, you're kind of setting them up for failure, right? And B, there are alternatives, right? We have native alternatives that may not work as good as that invasive one, but they'll get the job done. And you can use that as part of your lesson as well. We also have a lot of instances of crayfish being used in classrooms to teach anatomy, physiology, behavior, taxis, response to stimuli, various things like that. And similar to that Aguirre densa, red swamp crayfish are often called for in the curriculum as the species of choice because they're highly mobile, they're highly available, probably more so than anything. And it's also just, that's how it's been done. In some cases, crayfish can be sent home with students, which then results in a visit from Sam.
And this is where I got called. These are real life examples. I got a complaint to our hotline saying, hey, there's kids taking a bunch of crayfish home as pets. And I'm like, okay. So as I dug into this, there's that risk of free willy. The kids bring them home. They don't want to they don't want to kill the crayfish, right? They want to go set it out in the pond, or they keep it as a pet. And in this circumstance specifically, as I dug into this, there's biological supply companies across the nation that are sending universities, elementary schools, hundreds and hundreds of crayfish to meet their needs. And thankfully, in our circumstance, the ones I got involved, went to the house, photographed it for Patrick.
That's this actual crayfish in their kitchen with the coffee pot.
Yeah. Yep. We're looking at Willie. I'm like, I have no clue what this is. And
that's where I come in.
That's where he comes in.
Yeah.
And like, it was a native species. And they're allowed to have it, which is great. But as I dug into this company typically there was an off name, but this company normally sells red. And from 2020 to 2023, we did education outreach, providing them all sorts of different materials, letting them know that these are the crayfish that you can send here, these are the crayfish you can't send here. But as you'll find out later, we have a very high non-compliant rate for education. And in conversations with them, that company withheld information from us when we were doing interviews with them, and they actually sent disease shipments to
Researcher, right? Yeah.
research facility over in the Cross area, and that from 2020 to 2023 resulted in 20 convictions, about $6,000 in fines, and we haven't had an issue with them since that enforcement, which is good. And that's just one of many biological supply companies across the United States.
All right, so moving on, and I'm trying to keep cognizant of our time. Sorry to whoever, because we're going to go a little long. We'll be fast. Next topic is the food industry subpathway. So I teased that a little bit with the Java water dropwort. This is something that Sam and his team have been getting into quite a bit, particularly in Milwaukee with some of the ethnic food markets that have a demand for more kind of exotic live things in particular. So this could include things like a crayfish boil. Someone wants to import a bunch of red swamps from Louisiana to have a boil in their yard. Can't do that. Restaurants want to do it. Ethnic food markets. There's also the commercial fishing industry. Lots of different examples of this. Law enforcement work has been pretty heavy with this. We've also made connections with local health inspectors in West Dallas, Milwaukee area, who go into these establishments to make sure they know and they're aware. That was a group we never talked about before, and now they know they can report invasive species to us, which is pretty cool. So I'm gonna let Sam highlight a little bit, but that is all red swamp crayfish in that picture there. We have grass carp, big head carp. There's also eels, swamp eels, but I'll let you start with crayfish.
And this Louisiana crawfish company, this I believe established in 2019. Over that time period, they had shipped to Wisconsin just under 13,000 red swamp crayfish through online shipments to the state. That was a very in-depth investigation led by our lieutenant for the task force group, which involved wardens from across the state to interview different suppliers, purchasers, things like that. It led to 15 criminal charges through the Wisconsin Department of Justice, with five of those being dismissed and 10 convictions, with about just under $35,000 in restitution and fine.
And I believe this was the first criminal case on this topic. Yeah,
the very first case
that's had to go to the criminal level. Yeah, so we're taking it seriously. Is the takeaway there.
And in that instance, that was a lot of education before that. That was plenty of
years of it. Yeah.
Years, like, stop doing this, and it was very in depth on how they're getting around it. As we talked about some of the ethnic grocery stores and stuff like that, we've had instances where these shipments are coming from New York, Boston, Chicago. They're getting smuggled in across state lines in different avenues, whether it's being flown in, driven in by these markets through unmarked vans, things like that. They list them under different names. White eel is commonly known as American eel, but they're selling them Asian swamp eels, which are prohibited species here in Wisconsin. We've had numerous stores do this. We've had them do it for Asian carp, different like grass carp species that are live. So these markets have a wide range of purchasers coming to these stores and have a wide range of impact. And in Chicago, they've seen, like, to get the question, like, why is that important? They're just going to consume it for food. We have videos in Chicago of a family taking a big container of Asian swamp eels and dumping it into the Chicago River. We don't have any evidence of that happening yet in Wisconsin, nor hope do I ever see that, but it's really important that we prevent that and we educate these stores that this is an avenue of these species coming into the state. At first, a lot of them never even knew it, but now I've dealt with a new number of them where I've had to talk to these businesses a handful of times, and I've taken enforcement action for swamp yield and taken enforcement action for the Asian carp and stuff like that.
They can have them dead. You just can't be selling them live. That's kind of what it comes down to. All right, moving right along. So now we are talking about the pet and aquarium trade. So this is another one of those sub pathways, your aquarium hobbyists, your water garden groups. And for this pathway, we actually have kind of a unique program. So we have a lot of county partners in every county in Wisconsin that do aquatic invasive species work. We've actually developed a protocol, which again is unique to Wisconsin. Other states don't have this yet. For them to be trained to go into the stores and provide outreach and education on this topic, all those complex regulations we went over, to stores and be like, hey, we're here, we're trying to do outreach and education. While I'm here, I'm just going to walk around your store and see if there's anything present, right? So if there is, we address it with the store. We're not doing enforcement though. That is all education, outreach-based, voluntary compliance. Of course, if we do have repeat offenders, we can get our law enforcement involved as well. But we've been working on the pet trade for quite a while, and we're actually seeing some pretty good results of compliance. Folks are just not carrying the regulated aquatic species as much anymore. Similar to our DACAP inspection program, these are not inspections. We still track the data in a similar way. We're seeing violations go down over time. So we think that is somewhat indicative of success in this program. There's a lot of inconsistency in this. It's of course not an inspection program, so it's not as robust as what DACAP is doing. But we're still been having a lot of success and very rarely seeing species present in these stores. And when we do, they're actually not things for sale. They're more like pests, like that jumping worm. I'm going to give an example of an aquarium store pest, which has been really cool to see. Some of the common species we see in pet stores, this again dates back. We're not seeing these anymore. Kabomba is the one up there where you can't see. That's called Carolina fanwort. Brazilian waterweed, another, we just talked about that one. Malaysian trumpet snail, that's the pest. People aren't selling those. I'll talk about that more in a second. Water lettuce, and then moneywort. We've got a picture of crayfish here because they historically were very prevalent in the pet industry, but basically no Wisconsin stores are carrying crayfish anymore because of work law enforcement has done, not just for that food industry. They've had similar cases with the pet supply industry, and essentially the word's gotten out and they're just all out of the crayfish business, which is really a huge win. Wisconsin, we're pretty black and white. If it's not a native, one of our 7 native crayfish species, it's a prohibited invasive. So we're really glad the word's been getting out on that. There's some interesting challenges in the pet trade though, and these are also apply to, of course, the terrestrial trade. I work in aquatics. This is what I know the best. But things like hitchhikers, pests, distributors, and suppliers, that's an actual store that's an aquarium supplier. You can't tell me that someone doing a 10-hour shift isn't going to make a mistake and pick the wrong tank one time in their entire career. You know, these types of things happen. Species ID and labeling. I went into a store, there's something in a tank called Creeping Charlie. There's 100 things called Creeping Charlie. You know, how do you even begin to deal with that? That turned out to be Bacopa monieri, which is a non-regulated version, versus Lysimachia, which is our regulated version. We have dwarf species. We don't regulate that for hydrocodal, but we do regulate a different version. You kind of have to know a bit of in-depth things. And we have hitchhikers, that's mosquito fish in a feeder tank of goldfish, zebra mussels within mossball shipments, and then of course, difficulty with identification. Those are all red swamp crayfish. They're bred to be different, unique colors, but they're all the same species. If you're not trained and you don't know what you're looking at, you're definitely going to miss and just be unaware. So there's a lot of challenges that come with working with these industries that require a really complex knowledge base to be able to be accurate and concise. Here's those Malaysian trumpet snails. These are the jumping worms of the pet and aquarium industry. So no one is wanting them. They are pests. They're basically impossible to eradicate unless you nuke your entire system with copper-based pesticides or something like that. That's just not tenable for stores, right? So we want stores to be working on these. Sometimes they actually do pretty cool biological controls. So like pufferfish, assassin snails, if you put them in the same tank as the trumpet snails, they'll control them. The main thing we want stores to be aware of is if you have a presence of this in your store tanks, A, be working on getting rid of them, and B, you better be darn sure you're screening all of your shipments to make sure that they're not getting inadvertently sold with someone's legal plant or animal or fish purchase. New fact sheet as well, hot off the press this year for this particular industry. So this is geared towards the pond and aquarium trade. We've got examples up there. Please feel free to take one, or you can find it on our website. Same gist as the other one. Release happens. What can we do about it? So this is something I gave my shock value slide earlier. This is something that's happening, right? Whether it's a gap in outreach, whether there's always going to be a subset of people that choose to do this, we know that pet release happens. And we want to be able to address that. So we've got a few cool things that we've got working on that, one of which is a signage project. So looking at some of our hotspot release sites, some of those Milwaukee County park ponds that may have goldfish present, we know a release happened there. Again, Scott, our partner with Sea Grant, is working on a DNR-funded grant project to develop some signage for targeted release locations that we can have on the landscape to help remind people to make a better choice. We support JNR Aquatic Animal Rescue. They just held an event here about a month ago. They do no strings attached exotic pet surrender events, which is a really great resource. Again, Wisconsin is kind of a leader in this area. A lot of other states don't have that option. When they say to people, you can't release your pet, can't do this, they don't have anywhere to go. Sometimes they come to Wisconsin. We're really fortunate to have him in our state running events. There's going to be one in West Bend that Amanda Schmitz is heading up at the end of this month. Very well attended. Really, really glad we have that program. And then, of course, we do a lot of direct outreach and education, like we have here today, various audiences and things like that. That is a bunch of aquarium gravel that someone found at a boat launch. So that's what that is. Yeah. With nothing else. So then I'm like, well, where did it go? We're gonna do questions at the end. That's all right. Sorry. We're almost done. This is hard. So e-commerce, online, Facebook Marketplace, Etsy, all these different things. This is really hard for a state agency to address because we don't really have the ability to home these sites for various listings or things like that. Oftentimes we can't even access these sites with like a state computer and things like that. But we do get forwarded instances of people selling hammer maple, crayfish, snow on the mountain, pond water lettuce on Facebook from folks like yourselves. And this is kind of a call. If you see that, or you know people in your community that are attempting to buy and sell NR40 species, please let us know. We are able to address these. We always start with outreach and education, but for repeat offenders, we can use enforcement. And this is a really hard pathway to grapple with, but people in the community can help us because oftentimes it's your other community members that are doing this. These are the local sales that oftentimes fly under the radar, but we know are happening. And I'll let Sam wrap us up.
Yeah, and we've kind of switched. We still do switched our enforcement strategies to this the trade industry, right? But we still focus on the boat trailer with weeds. It's still a good priority. We don't want to spread that to our next lake, the zebra mussels. We still want to protect those lakes, but it's kind of a new strategy we've taken since 2019 from the law enforcement perspective. You'll still see wardens enforcing these trailer laws. So still important work, but this is a wide impacting trade industry that we saw with the aquatic invasives. And like I said earlier, we have about a 75% success rate with the education. When we go contact or I go do another purchase, I oftentimes get that product shipped or sold to me here in Wisconsin. Our lieutenant has calculated about approximately 35,000 or so invasive critters have been shipped or sold into the state of Wisconsin since from 2018 to 2023. That's only about probably 10% of what's actually coming into the state. We have dozens of cases that are still ongoing. I'd say our biggest hurdle right now would be that e-commerce, the Facebook Marketplace type deals, eBay, stuff like that. We've had a recent case where an individual in their basement had over 300 marbled crayfish in their basement, and those offspring multiply by 100. A single one does. So it's crazy, but it's hard to find that stuff. The only reason we did is because we were at a trade show and saw a single crayfish being sold that linked it to that. So it's if you're in your community and you see it, say something because otherwise we won't know about it. And what we've talked about this whole time is that enforcement approach. It's identifying who's doing this. If it's a brick and mortar store, if it's an online store, we're sending education outreach, whether it's the biologist doing that Liz Tanner sending out that education, or the Great Lakes Fish Commission doing that education for us. And then we'll attempt that's where I come in. I'll attempt purchases. If it works, if they sell it, I'll continue my investigation. If they don't sell it, I'll stop there. If they do sell it, we start the education portion again, and I continue to make purchases after that point. And then that leads to the enforcement approach, whether how egregious is this, how much have they shipped to the state. It really depends whether we go to the Department of Justice for criminal charges, or we handle it through our local DA.
Thank you. All right, last thing is I'll just mention, we are currently in the process of updating the state's invasive species rule in our 40. So there's some information here about the timeline. But the main thing that I want to highlight is there will be opportunities for public comment, right? So whether you're a general citizen, if you're a professional in the field, we are certainly open to comments. So please keep your eyes and ears open for those periods. This is a long process, right? The new rule won't be ready for a few years, but we really value the input from the community when we do these types of rule updates. So make sure to keep your eyes out for that and make comments if you have them. And I just want to end, we're talking a lot about trade today. And I think we, as people in the community, as consumers, we have a lot of power on this topic, right? Stores, industry will respond to supply and particularly demand of certain species. So the best we can do to purchase natives, to promote that within our communities, really goes a long way. And I think that is going to probably be the way that this is addressed more effectively than what we can do at the regulatory level. If we can show that we have the demand for native species, stores will stop selling invasives. And I think that takes a village, like I said earlier. So thank you for your time. I think we'll have some questions. I know there's at least one, and reach out anytime.